Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is David McElnay, and I'm current chair of the executive committee of the Urban Design Panel. And in that role, I'll be introducing our excellent panel presentation today entitled Climate Responsive Urban Design Concepts, focused around the CFEC, Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities legislation. The Urban Design Panel is sponsored jointly by the American Institute of Architects. I just lost my text. How'd that happen? By the American Institute of Architects, the American Planning Association, and the American Society of Landscape Architects here in Oregon, and is composed of professionals from these three organizations, both in our membership and in our executive committee, with a shared interest in urban design. We are joined today by Heather Wilson and other staff. Heather's the executive vice president, executive vice president of the AIA Oregon. The AIA has previously hosted this event at the Center for Architecture in Portland, and now generously offers this Zoom meeting until further notice. In addition to a monthly email announcement, our panel presentations can be found at the AIA Oregon event calendar on the web, as well as their weekly Thursdays at 3 newsletter. I encourage you to sign up. Participation in any event makes you a panel member. We encourage you to sign up for information about future presentations. When you register for any UDP presentations, you will be included in upcoming invitations via an email blast. We also encourage you to send any interesting future panel presentation ideas to Kathy Wendland at AIA Oregon, and Kathy will put her email address in the chat. These presentations are recorded on Vimeo and are made available by AIA as a Vimeo file, which can be found in the link also provided in the chat box, a kind of archive that AIA is courteously hosting for us. This presentation will be about 30 minutes long and followed by a Q&A session. For the Q&A, please pose your questions and comments in the Zoom chat box. Our executive committee member, Jamie, will be effectively curating the chat for us today. And when the presentation is over, begin to pull up those questions. Follow-up questions can be sent directly to today's presenters if they put their emails out there for us. And you can direct it through the executive committee as well. Look for those emails in the chat box. The presentation or presenters today are a larger panel style presentation. Fiona Lyon is TOD design manager at TriMet. Aaron Riom, planner and urban design at Sarah Group. Tim Smith, also principal at Sarah Design. Margaret Raymond, urban designer at Sarah, and Jeremy Shane, principal at Mayor Reed. So with that, Brian Campbell is also on this presentation panel today, FAICP. And Brian, I'm going to hand it over to you to take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. Hello, everyone. I'm Brian Campbell. I've been a planner in Oregon for about 46 years now, and so I'm retired, but still enjoying this life on the Urban Design Panel, which I've been a part of for about 10 years now. Before we start, I want to make sure all of you are aware of what the new Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities rule is supposed to do and why it was adopted by LCDC. In 2009, legislature passed an act to spur state agencies to enact rules and regulations to directly address climate change. So DEQ and other agencies have enacted a number of regulations to address greenhouse gas emissions, and DLCD and ODOT have made several attempts to get regional transportation planning agencies to do scenario planning with their member cities that would lead to the implementation of local planning rules to directly address climate in their jurisdictions. Metro's done this in the Portland region, but scenario planning elsewhere has definitely lagged and has never really been completely finished. So because of this, LCDC and DLCD staff made the decision several years ago to essentially take planning and urban design concepts that are well known to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, primarily through reducing automobile use by creating more walkable communities, and make them requirements tailored to city size and to be implemented over the next few years on a variety of schedules, depending on your size of city. So this has spurred some pushback, primarily over schedule and cost of implementation, but there's little doubt that the requirements in the CFEC rules are exactly the types of measures needed to address the impending climate crisis and provide increased opportunities for more affordable housing alternatives as well. And as we'll see, they are already a major feature of what many Oregon cities are already doing or already have in there historically. So with that, I'll turn it over to Margaret, who'll start our presentation, and she'll then turn it over to Aaron and Fiona to review other examples. And Tim will provide additional perspective on some of the examples as he's inspired to do so. So Margaret, take it away.
Thanks, Brian. So we'll start today with, as Brian mentioned, some examples. Just a couple disclaimers. We are aware that these examples don't 100% meet all of the requirements set forth in the climate-friendly, equitable communities requirements, but we believe they're rooted in good design, good urban design, and with maybe some small tweaks, they could certainly meet the requirements of climate-friendly and equitable communities if they don't already. Some projects are complete, others are in process or may need reviving. And lastly, these aren't all projects that we as Sarah or others on the panel have worked on, but some of them are, and some of them are just ones that inspire us to do good work in this space. So I'll start out with a couple smaller examples. The first is Cornelius Town Center, which has seen a lot of pressures of development like many other cities in Oregon. And this is an opportunity to bring in some of those climate-friendly and equitable community ideas like smaller block size, increased density, and getting community buy-in was a key part of this process.
So I feel like we're news anchors.
Yeah.
So what we're going to show you, I think the first couple are framework plans. And the reason we're going to do that is that really the scale at which you want to approach this legislation successfully is to really sort of have a big idea about your community and where it would be best to locate these things and how best to leverage these so-called climate-friendly areas. And so in the case of Cornelius, I think the big idea here is to take the state highway and this, it's a couplet, and really start thinking about how to, I like to call it civilizing ODOT's roadways. And so this is a typical problem in a lot of communities that are going to be affected like this. How do you take a road that is really a state highway and try to work on it in a way that it becomes climate friendly? And in this case, what it means is an emphasis on the public realm. So I think we have some other slides we could take a look at. Yeah. So really, when you boil it down, what we're talking about here, emphasis on the public realm, building buildings up to the street. This is not something you would normally do on a state highway, but if you can calm it in such a way and introduce curbside parking like we've done there, and try to get the parking behind, you really have something going for you. What we are discovering in a lot of these towns where we're working is that, as a basic rule of thumb, 3 stories of development is about the maximum you can build when all the parking on site is in surface lots. Meaning once you go, and of course it depends on the jurisdiction's parking ratios, but once you get above 3 stories, you're really struggling to park everything in surface lots. And so then you begin to climb into more expensive forms of development with parking garages and such. So here's a kind of basic solution for a small town in the Portland region, Cornelius.
Great. Next, we have Park Avenue in Clackamas County, or Oak Grove, another framework plan. So this was all about developing near a transit station, which inherently you start to talk about walkability, better bike connections, things like that. And so this plan looked at increasing density, setting minimum densities, and mixing uses. Right now, this McLaughlin Boulevard is primarily automobile driven. And as you can see on this slide, it rather as it exists. So this project was all about breaking up that block size, increasing density, like I said, and just making it a more walkable area.
So as opposed to the last one where we were trying to civilize a relatively manageable state highway, McLaughlin Boulevard is a hellscape, particularly down in this area, and it was not to be civilized. And so what we really did, if you go back to the framework plan, is we began to focus on the east-west streets and to call those as pedestrian oriented, where there would be build-to lines, landscaping, et cetera, with the idea, of course, that there would be parking in behind, and that let McLaughlin be what it's going to be, until Armageddon, when maybe we don't have cars anymore, but that's not the foreseeable future. And so, again, having a big scale strategy at the framework level is probably the way to go for many of these kind of difficult situations.
Okay, next we're going to move into talking about a couple of downtown areas, which are inherently walkable places. So naturally they fit a lot of the climate friendly and equitable community requirements. And we thought these were some good examples. So this is downtown Klamath Falls, and specifically the Arcade Hotel, which is slated to be renovated into a boutique hotel. And then we also have a map that shows some examples of how parking tends to work on these main streets. So parking in the back, you can just visually see how that opens up the sidewalks and the streets for more activation, more walkable spaces, more pedestrian friendly areas.
Yeah, so some of the best examples that are consistent with this legislation are actually some of our beautiful historic downtowns. Klamath Falls, Ashland, there's a whole variety of them that have just been able to maintain their Main Street fabric continuous and somehow get the parking behind, so that they've created a really wonderful walkable pedestrian environment. If you read the first sentence of the description of what a climate-friendly area is in the legislation, it's a climate-friendly area is a neighborhood where people can meet most of their daily needs without being forced to drive. And so here's a great example where that is probably possible given the existing structure of Klamath Falls.
And next we have McMinnville, another popular downtown area with lots going on these days. This map shows their current parking requirements. So in the darker purple, they have no required parking, and the lighter purple, which is adjacent to their downtown area, they require 50% of the parking in this area. And we're going to talk about two projects that have recently been developed in those orange star areas, and some unique approaches to parking to activate the most ground level space. So this is the Atticus Hotel in McMinnville. They have 9 on-site parking spaces, and 15 are leased from nearby uses. So just a creative use to meet the parking needs, not necessarily requirements, but so that's just a great model to then have more of this ground level retail space in the hotel entrance.
Yeah. By the way, that's a brand new building. So even though it looks like it's part of the historic downtown, it's a brand new building. And so they were just being consistent with the existing fabric and doing the build to line and minimizing parking. And the reason this all works is that there is a downtown parking strategy that covers the entire downtown walkable district, which enables you to get away with 9 parking spaces, for example, for this particular project.
And then similarly, we have the Chaos Building, also in downtown McMinnville. It's a mixed use building, also new construction that fits in with the historic fabric of the downtown. It has 0 private parking, and so utilizing, again, creative parking solutions in order to fit within the downtown.
What we like about this one, and we did not do this one, I don't think. So this is some other, maybe the designer of this is on the call, but what we like about this one is that they actually set it back from the street intentionally and created some wonderful outdoor spaces. And there's ground floor transparency. It's got all those qualities of great urban design that add to an active and safe street that you're able to do when you can deal with the parking in a way that is sort of pedestrian friendly.
Tim and Margaret, this is Jeremy. I just want to add too, as we're transitioning into some of these other scales, that planning for community open space is also really important. Gathering and outdoor plazas are the main elements of urban design there, where we're also meet people's needs of basically creating outdoor open space for them to gather. And thinking about parking as transitional and occupational in different ways over the weekend, so that it's not always parking maybe during the week, but also the streets can serve different purposes as there are primary open spaces cities begin to urbanize.
Yeah, we also know that the city benefits from having urban renewal. In this project, a lot of you are going to be working on projects like this, and you may have developers and they may have investors who say, oh, well, we can't, get funding. We can't get our projects financed if we don't have enough parking, et cetera. These guys had local investors. And so this is, the money is coming from the community. They're taking advantage of urban renewal, and it's really just a kind of great outcome from a locally owned kind of point of view.
All right, moving up in size, we have downtown Beaverton. And so this was the downtown Beaverton design plan, which sought to break down blocks, create mid-block crossings, create safer bike facilities and walking, just better walkability. The red areas shown on this map are mixed use areas. So trying to promote mixed use areas, as well as increased heights and density, and currently working on parking requirements is our understanding. But after that, we'll be mostly in compliance with the climate friendly equitable communities requirements. And a big part of this project was getting community buy-in for a pedestrian first framework. And so this was really key in order to get all the things that we need in these types of communities.
So even though this is a project that our office did, it was actually led by Aaron, and this was before the legislation, but it was it had its eye out that these things are coming down the pike and that they are important. The key thing that the city agreed to was this upside down pyramid, where the emphasis was really on the top of the pyramid, the bottom of the pyramid turned around, which is pedestrian, cyclists, public transit, and on down to vehicles. So that enabled that wonderful framework plan. And then all of these qualities here, things like street seating, like Jeremy was talking about, transparent storefronts, eyes on the street, outdoor seating, multimodal transportation. So we're really near a rail station, but we're also looking to coordinate that with buses, bikes, and then of course, public art. So the whole thing is intended to kind of work together as a pedestrian first framework. And I think our next slide, here's an example. Now this is a recent project. So this was not built based on the climate friendly legislation. It was built, however, and it really does conform to, the spirit of that legislation. So it's just a great example Anchor Moisen of how to be consistent with the framework plan in Beaverton.
All right, last in this section, we have the eWeb property master plan in Eugene. And so this is another example of partnership between the community, the city, and the developer in crafting the vision, and an emphasis on the process as being, again, a key component to a successful process and ultimate product. And it resulted in a mixed-use walkable district that aligns with many of the, again, climate-friendly, equitable community goals.
Yeah, this was another one that we worked on. And what really makes this one work is that it's a pretty rich combination of structured parking, on-street parking, courtyard parking. There's a variety of housing types down there, and it's all intended to work. But what really helped is that the city of Eugene had some reduced parking ratios. I think it was down to 0.75 spaces per dwelling unit. And it was just part of the city's goals to have a pedestrian district and get away from auto traffic. And the investors so far, I don't think we've broken ground yet, are okay with those parking ratios. So we'll see how this one goes. Again, this one was designed before the legislation came out.
All right, I'll pass it off to Fiona to talk
Yeah.
about some metro examples.
Awesome. All right. Can everyone hear me? No?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, we
Great.
can.
So yeah, I was just going to kind of transition us a little bit towards kind of the transit side of these CFEC precedents, and just kind of putting my own disclaimer out there. You know, I'm not a position of authority to kind of be talking about CFEC, really just kind of sharing my observations about trends and really trying to understand what strategies have been exercised here, you know, in our own backyard in Metro Portland area. So as part of my role, I sit both on the Urban Design Executive Committee, but I do sit in our transit-oriented development program at TriMet. So I'm constantly thinking about the relationship between this land use, transportation, mobility, really looking at parking, how that impacts kind of development around our station areas. And yeah, just kind of as a reminder, so I wanted to remind everyone, 40% of our statewide emissions are from transportation. So it is a really large chunk of that pie. And another fact that I should always like to kind of share is that there are 8 parking stalls for every car in the US. So it's a pretty significant number. I think we have a pretty big propensity to build parking as a society. So just kind of looking at that conversation a little bit more nuanced and kind of see, yeah, some great examples that I've observed. So yeah, I think if we want to go to the next slide, I think really just thinking about kind of that land use and building relationship, thinking about how TOD, transit-oriented development, can kind of help whittle that down. So yeah, looking at the graphic on the slide, I love this. It really, again, kind of reflects our society's desire for parking and trying to figure it in to kind of the form of our cities and towns and suburbs and even more rural communities. And really looking at that kind of linear relationship shown here is that the cost of housing really gets pretty expensive when you start to add in that required parking or desired parking. So just seeing how that fits. And yeah, just looking at the kind of embedded cost of development, I think one of the things that we're trying to think about is, like, you know, I think we live in a world where we know that parking is not going to go away, but understanding what the right ratio is, how to, you know, physically place it in our communities, and really try to think more creatively about mobility in general. So, okay, we're going to jump into some examples, as I mentioned. If we go to the next slide, and really just point out, you know, the things that already exist in our community without parking minimums, either by code or by variances. There's lots and lots of Oregon examples that have no parking requirements for commercial areas. I think Tim and Margaret ran through a few of those. I think Hillsborough, Milwaukee, Forest Grove, Staten, those are all some examples that do that commercial exemption. And let's see, so yeah, jumping into this project, sorry. We've got Walsh Commons on the screen. This isn't really a project that I see come up on kind of the radar for creative thinking, but this is a pretty unusual development. It's fairly new. It's down in Milwaukee. It's about 500 feet from a MAX station. There's multiple bus lines. It was developed by a small nonprofit called Northwest Housing Alternatives. And if you can see kind of upper right photo of the screen, the thing that immediately jumps off the page to me is that it's got this kind of campus feel. It feels like a little, it's not a building surrounded by a sea of parking. It's quite the opposite. There's, these lovely little open spaces that collectively share the development around them. And the reason why they were able to do this is that they really have this complementary use of buildings on site. So here there is an office building for their nonprofit, which has about 45 full-time staff. There's 28 units of permanent affordable housing, anywhere from 1 to 3 bedrooms. And there's also a emergency family shelter with about 8 units that provides assistance for almost 3,000 people every year. If we go to the next page, there's other amenities. We've got a resident community room, resident services, property management, there's outdoor terrace, playground. There is a small parking area with 29 stalls. It is shared parking, and it has some EV chargers in it. So that is down in Milwaukee if you want to check it out. The next project is pretty close by, also in Milwaukee. This is just in the planning entitlement phase. Actually, it's been a couple months since I've kept up on this project, so I'm not entirely sure what the current status is, but it's got a pretty interesting history. This one kind of, again, just jumped off the page to me as being unique about its approach to parking. So it's about 400 feet from the MAX station. And it is a project developed by Works Progress Architecture. And what they're doing is they're proposing a 6-story multifamily workforce housing structure. It's got 56 units. And they took a really innovative approach. They've got kind of a hemmed in site. You can see the MAX tracks in the front. And, seeing how expensive parking is, they had a strategy where they said, let's look around the neighborhood. Let's see what underutilized parking exists. And so they then went to the planning commission, basically made a case and said, hey, we've talked to a bunch of folks in the neighborhood and we've got an alternative strategy. So they've got 1 space identified for a car share, and then they found 43 other parking spaces on 2 separate lots and have an MOU with those property owners to basically lease those spaces for residents of this building. So just pretty innovative approach. And then, okay, we're going to hop down a little bit further southwest. We're going to go to the Tiger Triangle. Actually, if you'll go one more slide, Margaret. So Tiger 2 is also thinking really progressively about parking. I think everybody knows the story about Southwest Corridor, light rail, hasn't quite come to fruition yet, but it is still in the long-term plans. And so they are basically preparing themselves to be transit ready. They have aspirations of being the most walkable city in the Northwest, and they're really kind of taking this proclamation to heart. And so in an effort to really spur that redevelopment ahead of the transit coming online, they adopted what's called the Lean Code in 2017. And what that code did is it removed off-street parking mandates, and it also added requirements for on-street parking and public parking spaces, public bike parking spaces, I apologize. And I should also mention, it is in an urban renewal area with a TIF district. So it's really kind of fertile ground for transit-ready investments that come on. And so we're going to look at a couple of projects in the triangle. If we flip to the next one. So this one is up at the Red Rock Creek Commons. It was developed by SEPA. It's affordable senior housing. There's about 48 units and 22 parking spaces. So that's, if anyone's kind of familiar with kind of ratio math of units to stalls, that's about half a stall per unit. And I think the interesting thing here is just that a lot of us look to senior housing, I think, because not all residents tend to drive. I think they can be a little bit more limited in their mobility and require other means. So oftentimes senior housing can be a good creative use of kind of putting a transit appropriate development and less parking. And then the next project is just a little bit further south. It's called Dartmouth Crossing. It's a pretty large project. It's going to happen in 2 phases. The first phase is underway. Total, it's about 250 units. It's a range of studios to pretty large 3-bedroom family family style units. And this one is by Reach. It was designed by Bora. And so the first phase has 85 units and 4 parking spaces. That is like really, really advanced in terms of kind of thinking about that, again, that parking math. They did reach a agreement with the city to do a lot of kind of frontage work, really fill in those sidewalk gaps, and really help build out that network of PED connectivity. So as Tim was mentioning, you can really kind of start to build that network of being able to access all of your daily needs without having to get in a car. So the next project is called the Viewfinder. If we flip to the next page, this is developed by community development partners. It's about 81 units. It's all affordable, variety of 1, 2, 3 bedrooms, 64 parking spaces. So that's about 0.75 stalls per unit. So it's still, it's more aggressive than kind of 1 per unit. But just kind of interesting looking at the 2 and how they're taking a little bit different of approach, but just another good example of kind of pushing that envelope pre-transit coming online here. And then we're going to kind of flip to a couple more like really kind of transit oriented development examples. So we're going to zoom over to Hollywood Transit Center. This is called the Hollywood Hub. Hopefully folks have heard about this. It's been in the works for a couple of years now. This is a joint development project between TriMet and our development partner, Bridge Housing. So really we have an oversized bus stop here. It's super transit rich. There's 3 bus lines, 3 MAC lines, really great schools, grocery store literally across the street, surrounded by medical providers, lots and lots of community assets. So it's an awesome spot to develop housing. There are 224 large family style units. It's about 12 stories tall. Margaret, if you go to the next slide, you can see a visual. There we go. And so, yeah, for anyone who's done kind of development in the Portland region, you'll know that the city of Portland has a 0 parking requirement. So technically no parking is required here. The developer is trying to find the kind of sweet spot, I think, really trying to hone in on that richness of transit, but also, again, realizing the reality that some trips just can't be taken on transit. And so trying to find what the sweet spot of that is. And also looking for that availability of potentially some shared parking in the neighborhood. So they did do a traffic study for a max of about 40 parking stalls, but it's likely to be a little bit south of that number. And let's see. So I think we got one or 2 more photos of Hollywood. Great. Okay, so gonna selfishly talk about a couple more kind of TriMet transit-oriented projects for just a moment, and then we'll kind of transition this towards discussion. So this is one of our newer projects. It's at the Gresham City Hall, for anyone who's familiar with that. Right across from their City Hall, Gresham Station. You can see Max Stop just right on the upper right of your screen. And this is a pretty exciting project. It's really trying to convert a really underutilized park and ride to a community serving use. So the county, Multnomah County, approached us in late 2021 and said, hey, we have this bond measure. We really want to deliver a new East County kind of flagship library. And we think your site would be a perfect spot for it. And so we've been working with the county and the city to really help develop this project. It is a pretty big collaboration between all these agencies. And here's some more photos of it today. Again, it's a big parking lot. It's about 305 stalls. And And the site itself is awesome. You can see that transit access. There's a really great abundance of awesome assets just right in the quarter-mile radius around it. It is in the civic plan district, so it was zoned in recent years to be up to 10 stories. So we're really trying to maximize that density. So what we've done, and here's kind of a preliminary site plan. This is actually going to Design Commission tomorrow night for anyone that's interested in kind of listening in on that. Some really awesome graphics coming. But what we did is kind of break up the site to allow for future added density. So you can see the kind of footprint of that library. And then what Triman is doing is it's retaining that upper kind of northwest corner of the site to be able to do a future TOD to add additional density. And I think from a parking approach, again, trying to harness, there's about 450,000 patrons anticipated per year visiting that library. So we're really hoping to kind of make the transit access really desirable, really straightforward, like really awesome, so that people really choose to take transit. Should also mention there's the new Division FX bus line for anyone that's taken that yet. That is on the southern side of the property. So kind of a bookend of really awesome transit. We're trying to build a pedestrian connector in between. So from a parking approach, the library is going to provide about 70 stalls of parking, but those are all going to be subsurface. A good number of those are compact parking stalls. And yeah, just I think kind of a really great kind of pre-CFEC coming online approach to kind of maximizing opportunity and density on site. And then, okay, got one more in Gresham, and then I'm going to kind of close it up and we can open a discussion. So this is, oh gosh, quarter mile just to the west of City Hall, Gresham Station. And this is a pretty large project. It's on a metro offering site, again, right at a MAX station. Sarah Architects designed this project. It's a palindrome project. Just got its OHCS funding, so we'll be starting construction this coming year. And it something like really tries to like optimize that density. There's 437 units. There is about 10,000 square feet of commercial space. And it's 5 kind of separate buildings spread across those about 4 acre site. And they've got a 368 parking count, and that's all underground. So again, really trying to kind of keep parking from dominating the urban form, really trying to, strike the balance of market demand, but optimizing transit access. And Tim, I think you had an interesting point about this slide.
Yeah, what's interesting about this, so when you look into the legislation, they're looking for, under their prescriptive standards, about 30 dwelling units per acre. This one, according to the statistics, will be about 100. Okay, so it's over 3 times what's really required. And then there's a height limit for cities like Gresham that are 1,000 and above in the legislation. Gresham has about 113 or 110,000 folks, so it's up there with Portland and other cities of that population. The height, there's a height limits, and this one is, I believe, 85 feet. And so at 5 and 6 stories, we're just about underneath that, which means we've been able to really, this is like a prototypical project for the climate friendly legislation. I mean, it's got the right density, it's got even more density, it's transit oriented, it's got a mix. Not only is it 438 dwelling units, but 162 of those are workforce housing. And so it helps to meet not only that intention, but also they're looking for jobs per net acre as well. And so the 10,000 square feet of commercial will help satisfy that as well. So it's got kind of all the elements of a climate friendly, consistent project.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
All
I think
right.
we're done, aren't we?
Margaret, can we go to I've got just kind of one or two
Oh,
kind
there
of
we go.
summary slides, and then we'll open to discussion. So yeah, I think just kind of like generally, what are the themes that folks picked up on? I think, I'm pretty encouraged. I think there's a lot of communities and cities that have kind of preemptively started making their own code revisions to really get the physical form that they want in their communities. I think there's, shout out to all the affordable housing developers. I think they've been testing these waters for years just because of, the limited financial and kind of finance availability. They've been super creative. I think mixed use, I think the transit-oriented development program at TriMet is really, really strong on mixed use. And a lot of it has to do with that ability to like kind of pair uses, having that kind of 24-hour clock of activity, but also looking at, from a parking model, like, can you really put a parking space that is used for a resident overnight then be used for commercial activity during the day? Like just trying to kind of understand where there are those compatible uses. And then I think it can't be overstated, like looking at existing parking that we've already got in our community and really looking at how to fold that into uses better. And I think, we're all just kind of lastly, we're all acknowledge that parking is not going to just disappear or go away. I think it is a really large part of our society and lifestyle. And there's a whole variety of folks that depend on parking. But I think it is such a large part of this equation that I think that's why, it can tend to dominate this conversation. So that's why it's really good to be smart about it. And so one more page, and then I'll kick it up to Jeremy. It's just, I took a little bit of a look at any sort of research or studies that have been done about this. There's not a whole lot of kind of science or studies yet. I think we know, that there is still going to be a market demand. But looking at this little chart, I apologize, this is a really ugly chart that I made on the right, but just looking at kind of like pre-CFEC, a lot of communities did have these minimum thresholds. And so you were really bound by this kind of ceiling and floor. So with the rulemaking, the minimums go away. It really provides kind of a larger suite of opportunity to for developers to pick what is right for their, kind of risk level, their residents, their tenants. And so I think, the little amount of research that I found was about if you kind of eliminate all these restrictions, that generally it was about a 40% less parking provided. So I think this is going to be a really interesting topic to follow in years to come. There's not really a science to it. I think it truly is more of an art form. And it's just so nuanced based on kind of the existing qualities of a space. And a lot of it really has to do with kind of transit already being there or coming soon to help support these alternative means to mobility. And I think, as Tim has mentioned in the past, like this is kind of a return to the past in a way. It's not, it's our future and it feels scary, but like there's just so many examples in our community that really show just these kind of profound urban design impacts that can be had if we plan smartly. So I'm going to kick it up to Jeremy.
I'd like to say is that it's not rocket science. It's more like just good common sense urban design. And what better place than in Oregon to have this, really innovative legislation. I mean, I think if we can figure out how to make this really work, we'll probably be once again, a symbol for the rest of the country about how to tackle climate change through development.
Well, great. Thank you for a great presentation here. Going from the high level planning to pending implementation down to site examples of real world application. I want to So I point everybody to the chat. David had posted something earlier in the chat, trying to develop a poll. Maybe we'll get more sophisticated with this as it continues on. But there's 3 questions. How familiar are you with the LCDC ruling? What challenge and opportunities do you anticipate with the implementation of it? And then are there aspects of the ruling that you want to learn more about? And you can land those in the chat or send the emails later, but we really are encouraging you to participate. Couple questions. Let's see. Someone had suggested that we present this to the Urbanism Next conference. So we'll keep that in mind. I think it's a great opportunity to share a lens for sure. Let's see. David had asked, and I think this is to Fiona, of the examples, maybe it's to the group, of examples you've shown today, who in the community, transportation planning and economic development is pushing for solutions on parking? Was that open to the entire group, David, or is that, yeah?
Yes,
that
it was. I imagine it's a diverse group, but from all those great examples. But yes, I was asking the presenters.
Well, I can speak on behalf of TriMet. TriMet is absolutely interested in this. I think we're super keen on getting more development around our transit assets. And so I think part of it is helping developers, helping communities really come to like just understanding what these strategies are and how to implement them. So we're actually working on a document called our regional TOD plan that's going to have a couple pages of just kind of capturing what these solutions might be or strategies regarding parking.
Else want to add into that?
Say, we know in some of our work that our developer clients are also very interested in solutions for parking. And they're starting to see a little bit of daylight with their investors about these kinds of issues. You know, in the past, to get a project financed, if it was commercial or if it had mixed use and therefore commercial, you need to have a certain number of vehicles passing by your front door per hour or something. And I think those things are starting to get loosened up a little bit, which is a good sign. It will help us kind of free up to get back to not only some of the historic solutions that we showed you, but also some of these new and innovative things that we also showed you.
Speaking of alternative transportation, Laura asks, curious about how charging for electrical vehicles factor in on any of this. So maybe about different modes of access besides the traditional auto.
Yeah, I think, again, I'm not a state expert, but I do recall that there is a provision in the new rulemaking that requires you either provide EV hookup or make it EV ready. So I think running conduits to parking stalls in the future, or doing it as part of the development so that in theory they could be adaptable.
Yeah, I think the wonderful thing about EV charging is that once the technology gets there, it could actually be two-way, which means that if you have a car that's fully charged and suddenly the power goes down, it might be possible to use some of the cars or even electric buses that are hooked up and nearby as temporary batteries to keep facilities running. I mean, obviously, you don't want your local library draining your battery, but you know, we're going to have to figure this out because two-way charging is a technology that's coming. And it means that everyone driving an electric vehicle is basically sitting on top of a battery that could be used in an emergency.
Here's one about ADA parking, and I think it's referring back to the standards of minimizing parking on projects, but also providing adequate access. So how agencies are going to do about implementing ADA parking if the overall parking minimums are removed. Basically, making sure that there's adequate parking for accessibility, even if regular auto spaces are removed. And I imagine that ADA parking will always be a priority regardless of traditional sort of everyday user parking. I don't know if anyone else has any comment on that.
Well, I'm no expert, but I know that the American Disabilities Act is federal legislation. And so I'm not sure. That's a really good question. I'm a little bit stumped. I hadn't thought about that one before as to whether we're still going to have to provide them. The question, I think, is really whether you can provide fewer, because it really is based on a ratio of all the parking that's provided. So at some point, there's probably just like a basic minimum that you would have to provide. So good question.
Yeah, I think that's a baseline will always be maintained to some degree. Nancy asked if the slides will be available to cities or other agencies to sort of demonstrate these examples and the upcoming challenges and opportunities with the implementation of legislature.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'd love to keep building this deck over the years. We do, I should add, we do record these UDP panels, so we can definitely share that link. And just to kind of go back to the Urbanism Next conference that is coming up, I want to say in March, and I have a little bit of intel on just kind of who applied to those. And there was a handful of CFEC related topics that were proposed for panel discussions. So hopefully this gets good coverage at upcoming conferences in the coming year.
Hey, before we go to the next question, I wanted to circle back on the EV charging. One thing that is also an opportunity for us futurists is that think about EV charging as an opportunity to actually include charging stations as part of your mixed use development. Nobody in their right mind would ever put a gas station on the ground floor of a mixed use project, but you might put an EV charging station, particularly if it required enough time for your car to juice up that you needed to sit in a cafe and do some work and drink a cup of coffee. So suddenly storefront EV charging could be the wave of the future and a new element for some of our mixed use programming.
Yeah, and Tim, I'd build on that just another point, which is just that a lot of the shared car providers are looking at EV fleets. I think Forth has a number of EV cars available. So it can be, you can kind of hit both of those kind of shared resource as well as EV access point in a building.
We tried to downplay the parking role in the presentation, but it's very topical. So the next question also is about parking is basically asking, based upon the legislature and its requirements for near and future term requirements for parking, they're pretty prescriptive. How are folks on the panel looking at these requirements in their discussions with clients? So from a planning perspective, how are we anticipating or these particular requirements and addressing them with planning with our clients to minimize parking? It's an interesting one. I'll jump in. Fiona had mentioned Hollywood Transit Center and that development there, affordable housing there, and Mary reads on both the development side and the public transportation side. And what was interesting about the needs for parking, they really were downplaying the development side, is downplaying the quantities, but and they were, strategically trying to minimize it as well as they could. But it's also understanding that not everybody, while access to the public transportation, the light rail, and the buses were really relevant in that space, shuffling kids around to practice soccer practice or going and doing family events, there always needs to be a minivan or sort of rental or at least shared uses there. So I'm sure there's always going to be some degree of community-based or shared parking or auto use in them, even if you try to minimize the footprint of the parking itself. We ended up with still a number of parking and tried to stack them there. But
yeah. Well, I do know that our developer clients are always happy to be able to build less parking because particularly if they're in a structured parking situation, nobody wants a parking structure on their pro forma. But they also realize that they need to satisfy the requirements to get financing, and they also need to be able to sell, for example, housing units based on, hey, you're going to have access to a parking space or something like that. But what I think people are starting to get creative, like maybe you don't necessarily need to have your own parking space. Rather than having every dwelling unit have its own parking space, maybe there are parking spaces available and you would pay extra, which you normally would anyway, to access that parking space. Whereas if you didn't need parking, maybe you get a break on your rent. So there's a lot of dynamics here that we as urban designers just need to be aware of in those conversations.
There was also a note on just the basic needs for ADA and it being building code directed. A clarification by Phil there. Are there any more questions here? Or I guess we can leave it for open discussion. Any follow-ups on any of the topics on the poll? Is there anything, I'm gonna go back to this. Are there aspects of this ruling you want to learn more about? We've tried to highlight sort of implementations of large scale planning and then all the way down to some examples in the real world that are actually built today and working examples of them. It's kind of a range of topics there, but I don't know if anyone from the panel has anything else to offer. We can wrap up a little early if we're closing down here.
I would just say there's an excellent 6-page overview of the legislation on the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development website. It's actually written in pretty plain English and pretty easy to understand. It's got charts and stuff and graphics. So if you really want a kind of overview of what's in there, that would be a good place to start.
Maybe I don't know if someone has a link to those, we could put them in the chat so people can get access to them quickly. I guess, Lisa jumping around.
Someone sent me directly a question.
Yeah, and
Sorry,
I
here
just-
it is.
and
And I
so
think David
also,
just did the same one, same thing.
Right. Jason, whom I copied earlier, had responded to the poll. So this is his response in the question polling about familiarity with CFEC. So he's very familiar with CFEC rules. Some of the CFEC rules are not clear and objective, but they must be per state law when residential uses are part of the mix. Some in the community are lamenting the loss of required minimum vehicle parking. Others see it as an opportunity.
And the one I did is actually a question.
Yep.
About the CFEC.
I'll toss it out there for the group here if we can all read it, but several local cities have challenged the CFEC rules in court. Do we or anyone in the audience know the status of these challenges? And do you have any thoughts on why otherwise progressive city planners would do so?
Yeah, this is not an uncontentious issue. I also just kind of adding a little bit of thought. It's not always the city planners that are the origin of that legislation. It's oftentimes other political factors kind of pushing for that. So don't necessarily point your finger at the planners.
Yeah, I would second that. Well, this is all hearsay in a lot of ways, but some of the other people who are on the call here from cities might comment as well. But my understanding is a lot of this is just really about cost of implementation and the time that needs to be taken away from other projects and stuff. So yeah, other planners I've talked to have been definitely going, oh, that's the politicians or the city manager or somebody. So that's just from my hearsay stuff. So
we're nearing the end of our time. I would add that when we were prepping for this, really we wanted to make these accessible examples of real world that were planned and actually realized in place so that they're accessible. And so yeah, sharing this presentation would be helpful in understanding the level of implementation. I think we kicked this off, they all weren't meeting all aspects of the requirements of legislation, but maybe they're doing it in pieces and you could see clear sort of wins along the way. But I don't know, thanks everybody for such a great presentation. It's 1 o'clock. I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. appreciate everyone attending. Hopefully you've had a great kickoff to your year, and we'll be back next month with another presentation. I'm not clear what that is yet, but we'll send out an email when we get it nailed down. Thanks all. Have
Yeah,
a great
thanks for
day.
joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen.
Thanks, everybody.